The date is June 4th, 1978. A group of motorcyclists, including 16-year-old Roger Koch, were riding their motorcycles through Puma Forest National Park. They're out riding through trails, enjoying the summer weather, when something catches their eye. Slightly off one of the trails, they can see a Forest Service trailer. These are trailers owned and maintained by Forest Services that usually have food rations and heat sources and whatnot. However, this one, notably to the group, looks abandoned. It has a general sense of unkeptness to it, and that is especially apparent by the fact that one of the windows is broken. So, Roger and the group decide, why not go investigate it? After all, it's not very big. They just open the door, poke their head in, and see if there's anything cool in there. However, it is in doing so that Roger and his friends would stumble upon a key piece of evidence in one of the strangest unsolved mysteries in American history. This is, of course, the story of the Yuba County Five. Even outside of my channel, I've always found unsolved mysteries interesting. There's just something about them being unsolved that makes you wonder. It always keeps your mind coming back, wondering what could have happened, why it happened, who got away with it, and so on and so forth. However, I can say confidently that there has never been an unsolved mystery that has stuck with me more than that of the Yuba County Five. As you'll see through the events in this video, this case is specifically unique in that we simultaneously know the majority of the story and also none of the story. And while that sentence sounds rather vague, that will make sense as we go through. The story of the Yuba County Five chronicles 5 young men who disappeared and were later found under mysterious circumstances. These 5 men were Ted Weir, Gary Mathias, Bill Sterling, Jack Madruga, and Jackie Hewitt. All of these men were young adults ranging from early 20s to early 30s. However, each and every one of them had some sort of either developmental or psychiatric disability. Because of these issues, they all lived at home with their parents. All 5 of these men were said to be very high functioning. These 5 men were known to their family and friends as the Boys. All 5 were best friends. They were inseparable from one another. They often spent their free time talking about sports, as that was what they were primarily into, notably basketball. In fact, all met through something called the Gateway Foundation, which was at the Yuba City Vocational Rehabilitation Center. The Boys all played on a basketball team that was supported by the Gateway Foundation called the Gateway Gators. To understand partially why their disappearance is so bizarre, I think it's first important to understand the Boys themselves and why it's baffling that they would end up in such circumstances. Going from youngest to oldest, we start with Jackie Hewitt, who was 24 at the time of his disappearance. Jackie was born March 29th, 1953. Jackie was probably the shyest of the group, and it's because of this he struggled to kind of get along in day-to-day life with conversations and whatnot. Part of this is because he had a speech impediment, and he was also illiterate, unable to read and write. Those kind of put a hindrance on his willingness to communicate with others that weren't friends or family. Jackie's best friend, however, was Ted Weir, who was in the friend group of the Boys. Ted was much more outgoing and kind of took Jackie under his wing when it came to stuff such as communicating with others. Jackie notably hated phone calls in particular, so in the occasion that he had to make one and wasn't feeling up to it, Ted was more than willing to help his friend out and make the phone call on his behalf. Jackie also didn't like being away from home for extended periods of time, meaning he would rarely stay overnight anywhere, if at all. Jackie Hewitt's father has come out and said that Jackie, of all the 5 boys, was likely the lowest functioning, and because of that, it was good that he had friends that looked out for him and made sure he was okay. Gary Mathias was 25 years old at the time of his disappearance. He was born October 15th, 1952. Mathias was a U.S. Army vet, though it is believed that in his time in the service, he abused many drugs. However, his issues would only get worse when he was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, leading him to be psychiatrically discharged from the Army. After this point, he would go to live with his grandmother in Oregon for a short time. However, for one reason or another, he wanted to head back to California and live with his mom and stepfather. And in doing so, Mathias hitchhiked all the way from Oregon to Yuba County, California. The distance he traveled was about a 7 to 8 hour drive in car, and while he likely hitchhiked most of the way, it is said that he did travel on foot extensive distances. To stay fed and hydrated, he stole milk cartons off people's porch and ate canned dog food. But regardless, he made it back to his mom and stepfather's. All wasn't well upon his return home, however. There would be several instances of him having outbursts. On occasion, these outbursts would lead to law enforcement getting involved. After one such run-in with law enforcement after one of these outbursts, Matthias would be placed into a veterans hospital to treat his schizophrenia. While there would be a lot of trial and error in getting the correct dosage to treat his schizophrenia, the doctors did eventually find it, and even noted that Matthias was a stellar patient throughout the whole process. So once they found the correct dosage, Matthias was able to go back and live with his mother and stepfather. At this point, he began holding down a job helping out his stepfather's gardening business. It is worth noting too that Matthias was one of 2 individuals of the Yuba County 5 who was actually able to drive and had a license. Matthias was also the last member to join the boys. They had all been friends for years, but Matthias had only joined a few months prior to their disappearance. It is said by some of the other boys' parents that this often led to Matthias kind of being perceived as the odd man out at times. However, it is worth noting that Matthias, even though he was the last man in by a good distance, was still very close with the rest of the boys and was best friends with them nonetheless. William Sterling was 29 at the time of his disappearance. He was born April 5th, 1949. William went by Bill, and compared to the other 2 that we've talked about, Bill was very outgoing. He also graduated high school and was deemed a very religious man. The boys' basketball coach actually said that Sterling was likely the most intelligent of the boys. Jack Madruga was 30 at the time of his disappearance. He was born June 18th, 1947. Unlike the previously mentioned Sterling, Jack was shy and relatively kept to himself. Much like Matthias mentioned earlier, Madruga was actually a vet as well. He had served in the army as a truck driver for about 2 years until he was honorably discharged and sent back home. Upon his return home, he got a job as a dishwasher. Him and Matthias were the only 2 with a license, but Madruga was the only one with a car, meaning that he was the boys' designated driver. Now this was absolutely fine by Madruga, as he loved driving the boys around because he loved his car. His prized possession was a turquoise and white 1969 Mercury Montego. He wouldn't let anyone else drive this car. It was his baby, and he adored it. Because of this, he loved being the boys' driver, as he loved that car. Lastly in the group, we have Ted Weir, who was 32. He was born May 26, 1946. As I mentioned earlier, Weir was Jackie's best friend. All the boys were close, of course, but Jackie and Ted in particular had a very special bond. Like I said, Weir would make phone calls on behalf of Jackie, and ultimately just looked out for him and kind of treated him like a little brother. Unlike his best friend Jackie though, Ted was super outgoing and very personable. He loved interacting and meeting new people and just getting to know one, and was ultimately just the definition of a social butterfly. It is said by close friends and loved ones that for as outgoing and charming as Ted was, he lacked common sense. Examples have been cited, such as him being physically forced to leave a burning building because he wanted to sleep, and he just didn't quite understand stop signs. Like, he just didn't get why you had to stop at them. Ted's reasoning skills aside, he was beloved by most people that met him just because of how outgoing and friendly he was. So now that we have an introduction and understanding of the boys, we can look into their disappearance and why it's so strange. As I mentioned earlier, the 5 men played on a basketball team called the Gateway Gators. On Saturday, February 25th, 1978, the boys were said to compete in the Sacramento Special Olympics on their basketball team. The winners would receive a week-long vacation in Los Angeles. All 5 of the men were super excited about this event. They lived and breathed basketball, so there wasn't a chance in the world that they wanted to miss this. Some were even reported to set out their uniforms the night before just to make sure that they were all nice and ready, and even had some asking their parents to make sure that if they're not up by a certain time, to come get them up so that way they didn't oversleep and potentially even be groggy for the game. All 5 went in expecting to get a full 8 hours of sleep, wake up, go to the game, and hopefully win. The night before, however, February 24th, they went to see their favorite basketball team, UC Davis. They were playing in Chico, California, which was only about 50 miles away from Yuba City. Like I said though, before they left, they set up their uniforms, told their parents to make sure that they got up early the next morning, and then they hit the road, Madruga driving as usual, and headed to Chico to see their favorite team play. UC Davis would go on to win the game, likely leaving the boys with a sense of excitement. As their favorite team won, they were set to compete tomorrow, things were going well. It wasn't until later though, after hours had passed, that their parents noted that they had not returned home. This was completely unlike any of the boys to come home late without a call or anything, so they alerted the authorities. Through the police's investigation, they were able to narrow down their last confirmed sighting. What they found out was after the game was over, the boys went to downtown Chico to a place called Burr's Market in order to stack up on some snacks for the road. They purchased snacks, a carton of milk, and some sodas, and then left. This was a very mundane interaction, and the only reason the clerk at Burr's Market even remembers seeing the boys is because it was 10 p.m. and they were trying to close a little early. And with 5 men coming in right before they were about to close, the clerk wasn't stoked to see them, so really only remembers them out of annoyance. From here, one would expect the boys to get back in the car and head home. After all, they had their game in the morning that they were looking forward to. For whatever reason, that didn't happen. The boys didn't go home, and on February 25th, the day they were supposed to compete for the game that they had been looking forward to, all 5 men were declared missing. The police logically began searching the areas between Yuba City and Chico, as the boys would have headed from Chico back to Yuba City. It was said by their family that it was unlike them to venture out anywhere else, so this should be the only area that they could be in those 50 miles between the two cities. The case would take a bizarre turn, however, as 3 days later, Tuesday the 28th, Jack Madruga's car would be found. Madruga's car wasn't found anywhere between Chico and Yuba City though. Instead, it was found in Pumas National Forest. This is 38 miles northeast of Yuba City and is the opposite direction that the boys should have taken from Chico back to Yuba City. An examination of the car found snack wrappers inside, which is to be expected as they came from a market where they got snacks, but also found that the windows were rolled down, the keys were nowhere to be found, and the car was in immaculate condition. Yet for whatever reason, it was just abandoned in the middle of this national forest. It was in perfect working order, it wasn't stuck. The reason it was abandoned is simply unknown. The discovery of the car shifted the search to the Pumas National Forest. There was no logical reason as to why the boys would have been there. But if the car was there, surely the boys weren't too far away from it. However lucky they may have been to find the car, the luck of the authorities ran out, as harsh weather conditions swept in, and due to the abundance of snow that came with it, the search was postponed until weather conditions eased up, which, sadly, wouldn't be until spring of that year. This takes us to where we began this video, June 4th, 1978. About 3.5 months after the boys had gone missing in the first place. Roger Koch and his friends were riding motorcycles and came upon the forest trailer. There's a window broken, and it looks abandoned, so they decide to take a look inside. When they open the door, however, they are hit with a terrible smell. The group of motorcyclists are ducking out of the door, retreating away from the trailer, gagging at this horrendous smell that's hit their nose. Whenever Roger gathers up the courage to go inside and see what is the source of this smell, he sees, laying in a cot, a dead body. It would ultimately be found out that this body was that of Ted Weir's. Weir's body was badly decomposed, but authorities were able to tell that he had died from a combination of exposure and starvation. Weir was emaciated when his body was found. He had lost 80 pounds in the time that they had spent out in the woods. In the time that they had been gone, he had grown a whole beard as well. Investigators were able to determine that he had lived out in that trailer in the Pumas National Forest for about 2 months before finally succumbing to the elements. When his body was found, he was under a thick layer of blankets, though his feet were notably exposed, with no shoes. Looking around the trailer presented more details. For one, there was plenty of food rations for all 5 of the men that would last them months upon months, and yet only 12 cans were opened. On top of that, there was propane to keep the place warm, and this was super easy to generate, and for whatever reason, none of the men had thought to turn that on, leading to Weir passing away from the cold, under blankets, trying to combat it with no avail. Another detail about the trailer was that Gary Mathias's shoes were found inside. This shows that Ted was not the only one in there, that at the very least, him and Mathias had made it to that trailer. This trailer was 19 miles away from Madruga's car, meaning that it was a substantial walk to get there, especially considering it had been snowing in that area well before the boys had disappeared and on the night of their disappearance. So the fact that at the very least Mathias and Weir were able to get there in the first place was rather an impressive feat. For as unfortunate as it was finding that Weir had passed, it did reinvigorate the search. New life was breathed into the case, so authorities were able to start looking around that trailer. 2 days later, on June 6th, Jack Madruga and Bill Sterling's bodies would be found as well. They were located on the side of a canyon road about 7 miles south of where Weir was found in the trailer. Their remains were even more so decomposed, as it seems as though wildlife and the elements had gotten to them as they were found outside. When examining the bodies, it was seen that Madruga actually had the car keys with him at the time of his death. And on Wednesday the 7th, Jackie Hewitt's body was found as well. His body too was found outside, though about half a mile away from where Weir's was found in the trailer. And very tragically, it was Jackie's own father who found his son's remains. While 4 of the 5 men were found, the search persisted on for Gary Mathias. They searched that area over and over until finally on June 20th, they called the search off. And to this date, Gary Mathias has never been found. This case is strange enough as is, as it seems as though they could have left at any time, given the fact that Madruga had his car keys on him. And the fact that they starved and froze to death is baffling, considering the fact that they had an ample supply of food wide in the open for them in that trailer, and they could have turned that heat on. And yet, for whatever reason, they just didn't, and just let themselves succumb to the elements. Not to mention the fact that it doesn't make sense why they went there in the first place. All of this is strange enough as is. However, there is one key element that I've neglected to bring up to this point. It makes the case go from something that is simply unsolved to something that is completely and utterly bizarre. This would be the account given by Joseph Shones. As I mentioned, the last reported sighting of the boys was at Burr's Market around 10 p.m. on the night of their disappearance. However, there is one more sighting of them that, while it can't be confirmed that it was them, because the individual in question did not see their faces in particular, it almost certainly was a sighting of the boys, and you'll see what I mean here in a moment. It is the night of the boys' disappearance. There has been snow coming around in the area of the Pumas National Forest for a few days, and Joseph Shones was out driving on one of the roads back there. It's around 6 p.m. or so, and Shones is driving along the roads through the forest. And Shones is riding through the paths of the forest in his Volkswagen. At around 6 p.m., his vehicle bottoms out in the snow. Frustrated by this, Shones gets out and begins to try and push the vehicle out of the snow it is stuck in. However, adding to his misfortune, Shones begins to feel the early signs of a heart attack, alone, in the cold, in the middle of nowhere, miles away from the nearest person. Thankfully, he is able to get back into the safety of his vehicle, but with it being stuck in its icy containment, all he can do is turn it on to try and combat the cold and wait for someone to come help. And he just sits there, fighting through the pain of the heart attack and trying to stay warm through the heat of his car. It isn't until midnight that he sees from behind him 2 pairs of headlights. From the cars, he sees a group of men and a woman and a baby. Seeking help for his dire situation, he manages to get out of the car and beg for help. They're a good distance away from him to where he can't really see them, more so their silhouettes, but they should be able to hear him from how he is yelling, and seemingly they do. Upon hearing Shones' pleas, the group halts their conversation and turns off their headlights, seemingly not wanting to be seen or heard for whatever reason. There's no doubt that even though he was a distance away, they heard him. So, kind of accepting defeat, Shones gets back in his car to stay warm and waits. A few hours later, he sees flashlights out in the distance, He once again gets out and yells for whoever's out there to please come help, I'm in trouble. And yet the flashlights turn off, and once again no one comes. Sometime after this, Shones' car would run out of gas, leaving him without a proper source of heat. Realizing that he really has no other choice at this point, Shones is able to get up enough courage to get out of his car and walk all the way back to civilization. It is on his way back, though, that he sees where those two cars had been previously, the ones that had turned off their headlights and ignored him. There is still one sitting there, a 1969 white and turquoise Mercury Montego. Now, Shones, of course, has no idea the importance of this car, especially in relation to the Yuba County 5, as at this point in time, they're not missing. He doesn't really think anything of it and just keeps going about his way. Luckily, Shones is able to make it back to civilization and gets help to treat his heart attack. Upon hearing about the disappearance of the Yuba County 5 sometime later, Shones would give his account to proper authorities. However, Shones' account leads to more questions than answers. Starting with answers, we can pretty well confirm that it was the boys that he saw. After all, in that group that he saw, he noted that there were about 5 men. He didn't exactly take a head count, but 5 sounded about right when he was asked. And the car that he passed, the one that was parked where those 2 had been previously, was that of Jack Madruga's that he had taken to the game that night, and that was found right there sometime later by authorities in the search. So we can pretty well confirm that Shones had seen the boys that night. But that leads to more questions. Who were the people the boys were with? There were 2 cars present, Madruga's and someone else's. On top of that, there was also a woman and a baby. Who were these people? Why were they able to leave when the boys seemingly weren't? Why did they come out there in the first place? And certainly, why did they bring a baby out into a forest that was snowing with storms coming? And the whole thing just makes it so much stranger. On top of that, the boys' families have said upon hearing this, it doesn't make sense for the boys to hear someone begging for help and not go to help them. It just wasn't in their nature. Did it have something to do with the people that they were with? Or could it be the reason that they were out there that kept them from going to help this man? But if that's the case, then why were they out there? The story is strange enough as is without Shones' addition. It's bizarre that the boys would go out of their way to the forest in the first place, but going with other people and not helping the man just doesn't make sense. In addition to that, it begs the question of who were these people that they were with, and why didn't they end up going missing either? Not that we'd want them to go missing, but if they were able to leave the Plumas National Forest that night, why weren't the boys? With all the information presented, we can start coming up with a few theories. These theories range from anything from foul play to simply visiting friends, but none of the theories really answer all questions. One theory is that the boys were visiting a friend of Gary Mathias. Mathias had a friend located in Forbstown, which isn't that far from the Plumas National Forest, so it's believed that after the game, after getting the snacks at Bird's Market, Mathias was able to convince them to drive to Forbstown to meet his friend. It's believed from here that the boys may have gotten lost, got out of the car for one reason or another, and simply went to the trailer, and we know what happens next. The boys succumb to the elements and are found in that summer. However, it is said that it is extremely unlikely that the boys, wanting to make sure they got enough sleep and not wanting to be away from home, would have actually gone up to Forbstown to visit this friend in the first place, ignoring the fact that they could have gotten lost. Not to mention, this doesn't explain what Joseph Shones saw at all, as they were with other people. That leads us to the next theory, that it has something to do with the other people that the boys were with. Like I said, there were 2 vehicles that pulled up that night, Madruga's and someone else's. In addition to that, there was a notable sighting of a woman and a baby alongside the Yuba County 5. It is believed that somewhere along the way, the boys ran into these individuals and, for whatever reason, ended up going to the woods with them. Now, this is open-ended, as we have no idea who these people were. It could have anything to do with them being simply people they met and hit it off with, and just for whatever reason decided to go hang out in the forest, or these could be people that meant the boys harm in one way or another, leading them up to the woods that night for whatever reason, and leaving them to die. Another theory proposed by Jack Madruga's mother suggests that someone else drove the car into the forest that night. For one thing, the car was found abandoned, something that she swears Jack Madruga wouldn't do. The route they took was covered in rocks and sticks and all sorts of debris on the ground that it is said, given that Madruga's car was very low-hanging, would have caused some damage, minor or not, to the underside of the vehicle. And yet, regardless of that, the vehicle was totally fine. As I said earlier, it was in immaculate condition. Experts have said that it is unlikely that anyone who's not familiar with that route that they took, especially at night, which is when they drove up there, would have likely had some damage to their vehicle. Again, minor or not, there would be some sign of damage. However, there was none, regardless of the fact that Madruga had never driven there before, especially not at night. However, what Madruga's mother says the most damning bit of evidence for this is that the car was found with the windows down. This was something that apparently Madruga would never do. If his car was parked, those windows were going up, especially if it was snowing, as snow would blow into the car. It's because of this that her, along others, believe that someone may have driven the car up there that night. This could be another party completely, or as some suggest, Gary Mathias. Mathias was the only other person in the group besides Madruga with a license. Some think this could apply to the theory that Mathias was visiting his friends. Maybe Mathias had talked the others into visiting the friend up in Forbestown. However, due to how rough the road was, Mathias might have taken over from Madruga. Again, this is basically ignoring the fact that Madruga never let anyone drive that car. And maybe that is the case. Maybe Mathias did end up driving it up to the forest that night, but for what? After all, the keys were found with Madruga, so that means when they got out, Mathias would have given them back, and then none of the 5 men would have thought to go down. The next theory kind of plays off of that maybe Mathias did drive him into the woods that night, but suggests that Mathias did it on purpose, acting on ill intention. This is a theory that I see online a good bit when looking into this case, but it really kind of falls apart if you think about it. If this was foul play on Mathias's half, why would he choose this way to do it? It means he would have either had to drive or convince the boys to go out into Plumas National Forest on some snowy winter day, right before their big game, which would have been hard to do anyways, convince them to leave the vehicle, and then wait for them to succumb to starvation and cold, because again, that's how the boys died. They were not murdered. There were no signs of foul play in that regard. It means that Mathias would have had to drive them up and play the long game for nature to take its course on them. That just doesn't seem like a very efficient way of doing things. Some have argued that the people that were spotted by Shones alongside the Yuba County 5 were acting alongside Mathias in this, but it just doesn't really make sense to blame Mathias for this simply because he was never found and was schizophrenic. Those seem to be the only reasons why, which neither of which are good reasons to blame Mathias. Yes, he had a rather checkered past with his run-ins with law enforcement. Saying that he led to the boys' deaths by just playing the long game with them out in a freezing forest and then disappearing forever is bizarre, and it is unlikely that anyone would commit a crime like that, especially considering the keys were found with Madruga, which means even excluding Mathias, if it was foul play at all, whoever led the boys up there to succumb to the elements would have had to basically drop the boys off up there, take the car and the keys, lead the boys to die, park the car, put the keys with Madruga's body, and then leave. It's just a strange thing to consider. What happened to Gary Mathias? Some think he's still alive. Mathias almost definitely took Ted Weir's boots, presumably after he passed away in the cabin. After all, it is said that the shoes that Weir had on would have been warmer than the ones that Mathias had worn up to the trailer, so perhaps to combat the cold, it is likely that he put those on to try and head out and find help, a way out, civilization, whatever, from the trailer, and he likely passed away on the way. I don't believe Mathias was involved in any foul play with this. I think he was simply a victim of whatever led the boys to deciding to go there that night. With all that being said though, there are just some things that leave you guessing. Who were the woman and the baby? What was their involvement with this, and what was with the other car? Because this opens up the fact that in the 2 hours between them leaving Burr's Market and being spotted by Joseph Shones, they met with another group, and then for whatever reason all of them decided to go into Plumas National Forest that night. Why? This could be something with foul play, sure, but the end result of how the boys were found deceased calls that into question, as it's just strange that if it was foul play, that's how the boys ended up. Was this other party involved in foul play? Or were they just people that the boys had run into at some undetermined time and for whatever reason went into the forest with? Maybe this does tie to Matthias in some way or another. Maybe he was going into the forest to meet his friend at Forbes-town and the boys simply got stuck and got lost. This case has left all who looked into it with so many questions, but perhaps the most prominent is why. After all, we know what happened to the boys with the exception of Matthias. We know how they died, we know roughly how long they were alive out in the woods. But what we don't know is why. Why did they go there? Was it some bit of foul play? Were they trying to visit a friend in Forbes-town? Did they get lost? Why did they leave their car? Why did this happen in the first place? And the unfortunate reality is, as it stands, we have no idea. Like I said, all the theories just seem to answer some questions and then leave others unanswered. I have genuinely stayed up at night working on this video, losing sleep, thinking about some way to try and connect all the dots, and I simply cannot. Not in any logical sort of way anyways. This is a case I hope to see solved, but unfortunately, where it stands right now, we don't know. That is the mystery of the Yuba County 5. That being said, that's pretty well going to call it for this video. I want to thank you all for watching. If you enjoyed this video, feel free to like, comment, and subscribe. All the typical YouTuber stuff that they always ask you to do. I want to thank everyone for all the support recently. My last video, a look back at old creepypastas, has been doing super well, and way better than I thought it would, and I can't thank you guys enough for that, so thanks a ton. I apologize, the audio's a little low. I didn't realize that till after I posted it, so my bad. I'll try and make sure this one's good for everyone. But yeah, as usual, I really just can't thank you guys enough for all the support on the channel. It's unreal, and just thanks a ton. So like I said, that's gonna call it for today's video. Thanks again for watching. I really hope you all have a great rest of your day.